Afternoon at 10 past 2 now. Hong Kong police have made the first arrest under new anti-protest laws imposed by Beijing. This is coinciding with crowds marking 23 years since the end of British rule. 9 people were held accused of violating the law, including a man with a pro-independence flag. A further 300 were detained after attending what the government called a banned rally. The new national security law targets secession, subversion and terrorism with punishments as severe as life imprisonment. Activists have condemned the legislation as eroding their freedoms. However, China has continued to dismiss that criticism. In direct response to the laws, the UK has offered a path to citizenship for Hong Kong residents who hold a British overseas passport. Let's speak with Stephen Chan, Professor of World Politics at SOAS, that's the School of Oriental and African Studies. Stephen, good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon to you.
What are we making of this first arrest? It's clearly hugely symbolic and, I would imagine, the direction of travel from Beijing's perspective.
It's very, very much a crackdown to make it clear to everybody in Hong Kong that Beijing wants to take this very, very seriously. Whether they can keep up this volume of arrest is very, very much down to whether or not the Hong Kong people are going to challenge this and take to the streets in great numbers. If they do take to the streets in great numbers, of course you can't arrest everybody. If, however, there are any sporadic protests, then Beijing probably will continue to arrest as many people as possible.
This is hugely symbolic, of course, the first arrest. One can't help but wonder, Stephen, whether it will be followed by a fairly austere punishment in order to continue that sense of symbolism.
It depends how many people they arrest in this first week. It's very much, as I said, outturn in terms of the protest numbers. This is going to be important. But yes, I think Beijing would wish to see some kind of exemplary punishment. And not only that, what is held in reserve with the new security laws, the possibility of extradition to mainland China and the possibility of being punished there. Now, that is meant to be the whip that is going to bring Hong Kongers into some kind of order. Because it's one thing to be punished underneath penal system in Hong Kong, and another thing entirely to be punished underneath a penal system in China. So the real test is when will be the first penal punishment in China of a Hong Kong protester.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. And so what has largely happened then? As I understand it, Stephen, this is your area. After British rule went, there were agreements in place, sort of 50 years of retaining the status quo or thereabouts. Has that all completely gone by the wayside now?
It's certainly going by the wayside. I mean, I take this latest security law basically as a legal annexation. So Beijing now has some supremacy over Hong Kong law and the Hong Kong sense and the Hong Kong right to self-jurisdiction. So yes, we haven't lasted 50 years at all, which was meant to have been the case from 1997. I think this is a very deliberate and dramatic backsliding from that undertaking.
In addition to that, of course, the wider issue of China's image around the world, which of course has come into question quite a lot recently for a variety of reasons. This kind of continues to seal that sense that China don't much care what the rest of the world thinks. Is that fair?
That's a fair comment, but I don't think they would have been quite so draconian here in Hong Kong and across the board if they hadn't decided they had to take a firm stand of being completely independent of pressure from the United States. So Hong Kong is basically a casualty of the very cack-handed, very clumsy attitude of President Trump's United States. So that China takes every single possible opportunity. And of course, when Hong Kong is right on your doorstep, why not take advantage of that opportunity to show it is tough, that it cracks down, that it doesn't care, that it can go its own way. If there had been better diplomacy with China overall, I think China would have been more softer-handed in terms of its international diplomacy and in terms of its diplomacy towards Hong Kong.
There is a sort of a sense that, I mean, certainly my reading of it from a journalistic perspective, Stephen, was that, in the last couple of years, what I thought I was seeing was a new kind of China, a China that was moving forward, that was becoming part of more in Western terms, more of that kind of alliance, a country to do business with, not in that kind of slightly secret way that it always felt, but in a very open way. I was seeing the Chinese president on red carpets being welcomed with open arms, pressing the flesh with world leaders. There was a different image to China. What I'm sensing now is that we've gone back a little bit on that.
Well, we've gone back a long, long way. And as I say, American diplomacy is very, very much at the heart of all of this. The United States has handled China very, very badly and very clumsily. The European powers, France in particular, have tried to mitigate this kind of damage. But the fallout is going to affect all of us and has certainly affected Hong Kong. As for China itself, we all hoped that President Xi was going to be some kind of liberal reformer. That was his reputation before coming to power. But very, very clearly, there are all kinds of factions in Beijing, including some very strong hardline factions. And it seems that President Xi has had to come down on the side of the hardliners in order to protect his own position.
So what specifically has Mr. Trump done, do you sense then, to tinker with this relationship, for China to almost double down on their current position and intents?
Basically, trying to pick a trade war with China as the magic means of answering the difficulties of economic meltdown in the United States itself was a mistake. There are all kinds of internal difficulties that you can't deflect by simply blaming somebody else. And then the whole idea of Huawei, the cell phone provider, the internet provider, being in some way involved in an espionage and hacking war against the United States. Again, there's no real evidence of that, but that became a very, very handy whipping boy, as it were. So a whole variety of things like that, basically to meet domestic circumstances in the United States. And of course, what sealed it all is President Trump's blaming China for the COVID-19 crisis. Now, there's no doubt that COVID-19 began in this particular incident in China. But we've had pandemics starting from different parts of the world throughout this entire century. I mean, the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu after 1919 actually began in the United States, and that killed millions of people. So we're living in an era where pandemics are likely to become more common, unfortunately. Blaming one country is not going to be the means of ending them. So this idea of seeking an enemy, of seeking a blame target, which seems to be very, very much a populist election-winning strategy on the part of President Trump, is actually ruining international relations on any kind of responsible basis.
Although, of course, there is some support for Trump in the sense that people say, well, actually, blaming one country when that country was not open about what was happening with coronavirus, and particularly things like human-to-human contact. I mean, if that turns out to be absolutely the case, then not unreasonable that the Americans and others would be a bit grumpy about that.
Oh, they can be grumpy. I mean, the American response to COVID-19 hasn't been particularly good either, nor has ours. When you look at the United Kingdom response to it and how far behind each step we were at almost every single possible step, well, the Chinese went through that period as well. In other words, they behaved pretty much as we did. They caught up very fast, though, which is more.
True. But I mean, in terms of sharing information about the pandemic in the first place.
Well, they had to make certain that what they were sharing was true. I mean, don't forget, there were all kinds of difficulties as to identifying the actual cause, location, and the extent of this pandemic. No one knew the mutating capacities of this particular virus, for instance. It turned out to be very, very different from SARS. I think that the Chinese modeled their first response on how they handled SARS. But this is a very, very totally different type of virus. So waiting for the scientific evidence to come in, it may be excessive caution, it may be trying to mitigate political fallout and diplomatic fallout. Yes, the Chinese could have been faster, but at the same time, as I say, we all could have been faster. Having said that, I myself do think the Chinese should have been faster. They had the capacity.
Okay.
I don't think they took it seriously as much as they should have had at first.
Good work. Stephen, nice to have you with us, sir. Thank you, Stephen Chan, who's Professor of World Politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies.